Okay, today's theme is the ratification of the Constitution and compromises, and the key word compromise. So we're going to talk about today the ongoing impact of political negotiation and compromise at the Constitutional Convention on development of the constitutional system. We've talked about this before, but this goes into a little more depth. We're also going to revisit the Constitutional Convention discussing the Articles of Confederation. So it's going to be solid in our minds when it comes test time. All right, so what was the purpose of the Constitutional Convention? Of course, it was to go over the weaknesses, to address the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And of course, Shays' Rebellion was kind of the touchstone event that, encouraged all the members to meet in Philadelphia. Initially, of course, as mentioned before, it was supposed to just be a fixing convention. It wasn't to scrap the articles altogether, but ultimately that's what was decided, is the drafting of a new constitution, which would strengthen the federal government. And of course, the notable figures are Alexander Hamilton, a key proponent of national power. We know James Madison brought the Constitution, but Alexander Hamilton played a big role in emphasizing the need for a strong national government. All right, so the convention debates focused, of course, around power, and we're talking about federal power and, of course, small states versus large states. So clearly the debates encompass not only the ratification process, but the crafting of the Constitution itself. And in doing so, there was a need for key compromises, and which would make this a pivotal event. Known as the Great Compromise, this was also referred to as the Connecticut Compromise, and this was about how people would be represented in the new Congress. Again, small versus large states. The Virginia plan favored representation based on population. The New Jersey plan favored equal representation for each state, but ultimately it was the so-called Connecticut Great Compromise plan that determined that a House of Representatives would be set up, and that'd be based on population, whereas the Senate would be provide equal representation for each state. So that would make everybody happy. Equally powerful is the House and the Senate. The election of the president is an interesting question because ultimately there was a fear that one tyrant would be replaced with another. I mean, there were people calling for George Washington to be kind of a lifetime president, but ultimately that was determined to be not a good idea. And so, there was debate going back and forth whether the president should be elected by the people, the state legislatures, or Congress. And the compromise was the Electoral College, a system that emerged that each state would have a certain number of electors equal to its representation in Congress, and those electors would then vote for the president, and the candidate with the majority of electoral votes would assume office. It's interesting because I think a lot of Americans don't realize, they say, well, who elects the president? And many would say, oh, the people elect the president, but in fact, the electors do. And of course, there have been occasions where a popular vote has been subceded, what's the word? Has been over I'm having a hard time communicating, has been checked by essentially the Electoral College. So there might have been a popular vote in favor of Hillary Clinton, for example, but because of the Electoral College and particularly the swing states, which we'll get into, it ultimately handed the victory over to Donald Trump. And it's happened like 4 different times in our history where the Electoral College has overridden the popular vote. All right, a couple of other things to talk about. That refers to, of course, what was going on with slavery and the population count itself for representation. And so the 3/5 compromise, kind of an infamous agreement whereby slaves, which, kind of outnumbered the general population in the southern states, and the Northerners and the Federalists were concerned that the Southerners would, Southern states would have more power. And so they came up with this compromise, which made 3/5 of a slave into a person. So it would take 2 slaves to equal 1 person, and that, I guess, settled down the population count. Of course, these folks couldn't vote, and so really, again, this was just about the idea of power balance between the North and the South. So anyway, the compromise, of course, aimed to balance the interest of states with large enslaved populations and those with fewer enslaved individuals. And then, of course, there was another compromise, and that was regarding slavery, and it dealt with the importation of enslaved people. Some delegates advocated for the immediate abolition of the slave trade, while others vehemently opposed such a measure, and the compromise reached was to delay the ban on the slave trade for 20 years, after which it was officially abolished in 1808. They never would have signed the Constitution if they tried to resolve the issue of slavery. Even though there were Federalists who opposed slavery, it never would have gotten the Constitution ratified. The country was too divided at this point. And so they came up with this ban on the importation of enslaved people. So anyway, these compromises were crucial in achieving consensus among the states and ensuring the ratification of the Constitution. But it's important to note that the debates over the role of the central government, the power of state governments, and individual rights, which were central to the convention, continued to shape our political discourse today. We know that a Bill of Rights wasn't agreed to at the convention. It was agreed to 2 years later, and we'll go over that story in the future. But there were several things that were not accomplished at the convention, but the new Constitution was, and that was a major, major outcome. Now, the contemporary debates today, we still have some of these questions, unsolved questions or debates, let's just say, such as government surveillance as well as education. There's a tension between central power and individual rights, and that becomes apparent when we talk about government surveillance in the aftermath of 9/11 terrorist attacks. And also, the idea of the federal government involvement in education through legislation known as the No Child Left Behind Act. So there's still, big debates over this, and we'll get in again. We'll go into surveillance. We'll go into No Child Left Behind in the future. So despite the challenges and compromises that characterized the creation of the Constitution, it was eventually ratified by all states by 1790, with Rhode Island being the last to do so. The debates and compromises of that era continue to shape our nation's governance and remain relevant to this day.